In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can use aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis to help us better understand economic growth and to illustrate it. So let's begin by looking at our first diagram, and this looks quite different to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagrams we've looked at so far because there are two aggregate supply curves. Now these two curves are not a shift, they both illustrate something quite different. So we have two aggregate demand curves as well, but this is simply representing a shift where aggregate demand has increased from AD1 to AD2. But we also have this SRAS curve, which is the short run aggregate supply. And we have this vertical line, which is LRAS, which is the long run aggregate supply curve. And what we need to understand about these two supply curves is that the short run aggregate supply curve tells us how supply changes, obviously in the short run, but also how aggregate supply changes in relation to price. So we see that as the price changes, aggregate supply changes. As the price level increases, we know that suppliers will want to increase supply, and that's what we see happening in the aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve. The long run aggregate supply curve, however, we can think of this as being exactly the same as the production possibility frontier that we looked at in the last video, because the long run aggregate supply curve represents the maximum that we can produce in our economy if we use all of our resources in the most efficient way. So the long run aggregate supply curve represents the potential of our economy. And what we see here with the shift in aggregate demand is we see how demand is changing, maybe because consumer spending has increased or government spending or investment spending. But for whatever reason, aggregate demand has increased. It has shifted outwards to the right. So the quantity, the real national output, has increased from Y1 to Y2. And what this has done is it's moved the output of our economy closer to the potential output of the long run aggregate supply curve. So the potential output of the economy can be seen along the bottom axis as YFE, and that shift in aggregate demand caused, as I say, by one or more of the components of aggregate demand increasing, has caused a movement from Y1 to Y2. So real national output has got closer to the maximum potential of the economy in this diagram. So in this second diagram, what we're looking at is a short-term change in short-run aggregate supply. Changes in short-run aggregate supply are by their very nature always going to be short-term, because that's what short-run aggregate supply is all about. It's about the short term. So we have our original short-run aggregate supply curve. That's the top one, SRAS1. And at that point of supply, we can see that the national output is at point Y1 on the bottom axis. Now something has happened here. Maybe wages have gone down, maybe costs of production have fallen. Whatever it is has happened, it's encouraged all suppliers to increase their output. So short-run aggregate supply has moved from SRAS1 to SRAS2. And we can see the impact of that on national output. It's moved from Y1 to Y2. So output across the whole economy has increased. And that's because something significant has changed in the economy, across the whole economy. So it might be, as I said, a reduction in costs for employers leading to higher profits, which in turn would incentivize them to produce more. And this shift in short-run aggregate supply has created a movement along the aggregate demand curve. And again, what we see here is that output has moved a little bit closer to the full potential of the economy, which is shown by the long-run aggregate supply curve. So output has moved from Y1 to Y2, and that's brought output closer to the maximum of YFE. On this diagram, we're just purely looking at the long-run aggregate supply curve in order to explain a little more what we mean by long-run aggregate supply and how we illustrate it on a diagram like this. So the first thing to notice is that the long-run aggregate supply curve is always a vertical line, always, and that's because the change in the long-run aggregate supply curve has nothing to do with the price level. The long-run aggregate supply curve will be the constant at any price. The thing that increases long-run aggregate supply, as we discussed in our previous video, is either an increase in the quantity of factors of production. So maybe we discover more minerals in our country, maybe we get more workers coming in, migrating into our workforce from other countries. So we might have an increase in the quantity of the factors of production, or there might be an increase in the quality of the factors of production. So we might do lots of research and development and get technological breakthroughs. We might discover a way to enable farmers to produce more crops from the same amount of land, or we might educate our workers to make them more productive. So any of these things, a change in either the quantity of the factor of production or the quality, any of these things will move the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And as I said, we can think of this long-run aggregate supply curve as being the same as the PPF because it represents the maximum potential of our economy. So as our economy develops and our workers become more educated and our levels of technology become better and the capital goods that we're using become more advanced, our long-run aggregate supply curve in the economy will generally tend to shift rightwards, as we see here, and with it, real national output increases. So this diagram shows us what happens when there's higher aggregate demand, so short-run aggregate demand, and an increase in the long-run aggregate supply curve. So in this diagram, we've got two different things going on. Let's deal with long-run aggregate supply first. And we can see here that long-run aggregate supply has shifted to the right from YFE to YFE2. And that must be because in this economy, there's either been an increase in the quantity of factors of production or an increase in the quality of the factors of production, as we've discussed. But the net effect of that is that the potential of this economy has increased. This economy is now able to produce more. At the same time, there has been a positive shift in aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve has shifted from AD1, it's shifted rightwards, outwards, to AD2, and that means that more is being demanded at any price. Now this goes back to our aggregate demand formula. The reason for that shift must be that either consumer spending or government spending or investment spending or export spending, one or a combination of those must have increased to have caused aggregate demand to shift out to the right. Now, when aggregate demand shifts by such a distance, if there is no increase in supply, we would expect prices to increase, because fundamentally that means that there are more people chasing the same goods. However, in this case, price has increased slightly, but not very much at all, and that's because both short-run aggregate supply have increased and long-run aggregate supply has increased as well. So as demand has increased, supply has also increased, keeping the equilibrium price level at more or less the same level, although it's gone up a little bit. And this is ideally what we want in our economy. We want supply and demand to change at the same level because that keeps the prices level. So, we've looked at how economic growth comes about. It comes about as a result of either an increase in aggregate demand for short-run economic growth or an increase in long-run aggregate supply for long-run economic growth, or often as a result of both of those things. But why do we care? What are the benefits of economic growth? Well, some of the benefits, and we don't always get these benefits, but some of the benefits are new jobs in the economy. If our economy is producing more, we would expect there to be new jobs in the economy, and we would expect that to lead to higher living standards, higher real incomes for people. And as businesses are busier and workers are more likely to be employed, then this is going to generate more tax revenues for government. And of course, the government doesn't hang on to that money. It uses that money to build schools and hospitals and infrastructure. The rising incomes may be used to reduce poverty if there's some measure of equality in the economy. And of course, as businesses make higher profits, they can use some of those profits to increase investment, and we begin to get then a virtuous circle of profits leading to investment, and investment leading to more profits, and those profits being ploughed back into investment. That is the ideal scenario for an economy. As well as benefits, though, there are some risks associated with economic growth. As I discussed earlier, if we get a big increase in aggregate demand and that's not matched by an increase in supply, then there's a risk of what we call demand pull inflation. Prices go up because there are more and more consumers chasing the same number of goods. So if aggregate demand increases and there's not an equal match in increase in supply, then we'll get demand pull inflation. Previously, I said that economic growth is often linked with rising incomes, and it is, but it's also often linked with rising inequality. And this seems to be an increasing factor in economies where the wealth is often concentrated in the hands of a few people. The biggest risk that I think we're all aware of is the risk of environmental damage and environmental costs, and linked to that, the over-exploitation of scarce finite resources. Increasingly, individuals and societies and governments are concerned about pollution from fossil fuels, about plastic pollution, and about shortages of basic necessities like water, for example. So economic growth does have very serious risks as well. We talked about the benefits of increased capital investment that helps the future economy to grow, but of course there is an opportunity cost to that. If we're ploughing all our money back into capital investment, then there's less money available to serve the public good perhaps. And there is also an argument that if we focus solely on economic growth, then we get a society that is very focused on consumerism, owning things, buying things, and that can cause social problems. So economic growth definitely is seen as a good thing, particularly for developing countries, but I think in developed countries there are beginning to be questions about whether economic growth is everything. Okay, we're going to finish there, and there are a few questions for you to answer now.